It's come to that point with Civ 6 where I now have way more than 2,000 hours of playtime with the game. That is a good thing or a bad thing depending on your valuation of the importance of time and whether Civ 6 is an important thing to be doing with that time or not. But one thing it has left me is a list of things that I would love to see either patched with some new Frontier Pass 2 or a new piece of DLC with Civ 6, or things I would love to see implemented with Civ 7. This video is a combination of the thoughts I've had over those 2,000-ish hours, and I've also been asking my Discord to kind of have a really good understanding where other people are. I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of hours between us, so this hopefully should be an interesting combination of things that would be brilliant to take into the new game. This is not a definitive list, there are all kinds of things that need changing, and this is a list of things that I would like to see implemented with the new game. These are broader mechanics that involve quite a lot of sweeping changes with the game itself. These are not little fixes of things that could be patched into Civ 6 as it stands now. I'm going to do a separate video on things like that, so if you see something I haven't mentioned, well, the chances are I'm probably going to mention it in another video. Number 1. Turn 1 bonuses. One of the cool things that Civ 6 brought into the game was the difference between the Nations bonus, so Nobel Prize here being particularly Sweden's thing, and Christina, the leaders' bonuses up the top. You can have two different things. So in the cases of England, for instance, Queen Victoria and Eleanor of Aquitaine can give two different versions, although the England bonus doesn't change between them. I like that, it means there's a lot of variety. Apart from a small handful of civs, however, unfortunately what tends to happen is that on turn 1 the start always looks the same. You have a settler and you have a warrior. I'd love it if they brought back the idea of a turn 1 benefit. Now this is something that Civ has played with before. Specifically, I can remember them doing it with Beyond Earth. Beyond Earth is a funny game, people either love it or hate it. I think it was really, really good. It was a really clever game, but obviously didn't have the same historical appeal that Civ did. But there are a lot of mechanics from that game I quite liked, and the turn 1 benefit was one of them. What you could do on that game was, as you were loading in the game, you said, okay, right, I am going to play as Sweden, that is fine, but I need a particular bonus, and it let you either pick with a starting builder, some more gold, you could start with an extra warrior, an extra population. I think easily you could throw into other benefits, like when you settle a city you got a little bit more land. Maybe you discovered the ancient era strategic resources, so as soon as you settle, you can immediately see iron and horses, for instance. But the idea that you can actually change your start a little bit, and that is totally separate to the Civ you're playing. So I could, for instance, play multiple Sweden games and start with a population 2 capital, for instance, or a population 1 capital, but I can see horses and iron, or maybe an extra amenity or an extra warrior, whatever it might be. I think that sort of starting game bonus would really help to just give a little bit of an element of twist and difference and optimization in the early game that might make it a little bit more interesting. Secondly, district adjacency and district buildings. One of the most perplexing things I've always found about Civ 6 is they kind of went really, really keen into expanding the city out from a city centre. So unlike Civ 5, when everything's stacked into one city, you now have things like campuses, encampments, and all other districts that now occupy actual tiles on the map. You can say the same thing as well about wonders. The problem is that a lot of the way that district adjacencies work is very, very map dependent. And when I say map dependent, I don't just mean the style of map you're playing, I also mean about your spawn and how lucky you are with your spawn. Now, campuses are a fantastic example of this problem, I find, but if we have a look, campuses are given multiple styles of adjacency. You get adjacency for every 2 rainforests, okay. You get adjacency from every reef, you get a standard adjacency from every mountain. So you can see, for instance, this tile over here is a +2 because I'm next to 2 mountains. So Stockholm, my capital, does have a few options. There's a couple of mountains scattered around that give adjacencies, and you can see down here, for instance, there's a tile surrounded by 4 rainforest. You can also improve those adjacencies with, special things like moving governor plazas in and moving your other districts in, but there's ways you can sort of deal with that. Other starts, though, are not quite so lucky. This is my second city over here, and you can see, short of the rainforest, imagine if this map was a little bit flatter and I'd started in regular forest as opposed to rainforest. some of the maps you get are just absolutely without campus adjacency. Plain starts, grass plain, like grass plains, I was going to call that grasslands. A lot of these, starts, you can just be flat and have no mountains around you, have no coast around you, and suddenly your campuses, well, are naff. Imagine, for instance, if I was playing as Australia. Now, this tile over here is already a charming tile, but that could be breathtaking, and suddenly I'd be looking at +5 adjacency tile over there. Now, that +5 campus, combined with techs and civics like recorded history, when you go to natural philosophy, double that, that's suddenly +10. You can have crazy science starts, and in other games you just don't get that benefit. What I would love is to see this district game expanded into Civ 7 or maybe even sort of, brought into Civ 6 at a future patch. I like the way districts are put down on tiles. I like the fact that you get adjacency based on the surroundings, but I would love it if you could change how that adjacency worked a little bit. Now, the Government Plaza is a fantastic example of this. If you see, we've got the Ancestral Hall, the Audience Chamber, and the Warlord's Throne, all as options within the same district. You pick one, and you can't pick any of the others. The neighbourhood is another good example of that. I think you've got the shopping mall as one option, and the food market is the other, so you can pick between amenities and food. This one is basically you pick settling, you pick war bonuses, and you pick extra amenities and housing for cities with governors in. So lots and lots of classic examples there of one district that does multiple things. Now, what I would love to have seen is essentially a little bit like encampments, where you can pick at the beginning between barracks and stables, all districts to have that sort of bonus choice. So imagine here, my campus right now has appeals and bonuses to mountain tiles. Imagine if that's not how the adjacency worked. Imagine if campuses were just built, and in the first building you pick, instead of just going in and deciding, right, I'm going to be building the library, you could pick between 3 different buildings. One of the buildings could be map orientated, so that gives you more adjacencies based on the tiles around you, be it mountains, appeal, forest, whatever it could be. The second could be increasing specialist slots, so it gives you less science bonus generally, but increases the amount of specialists that can work in a city, say for high population cities for instance. And maybe a third option, I mean this is just off the top of my head, gives a sort of weaker but more consistent flat bonus. So the first option giving you huge science bonuses, but only if your campus has good adjacencies and is terrible otherwise. A second one that gives you flat bonuses, and a third that gives you almost no bonuses but then big bonuses for specialists. Maybe it has 2 more specialist slots than a regular one does. I feel like districts would be a lot more interesting in those points. At the moment, campuses are a great example of this. Map dependent and spawn dependent. You can have games where +5, +6 campuses are everywhere, and you can have games where you're fighting to get a +1, especially because of the way they changed the later game civics, where you're actually, with rationalism, trying to get +4 adjacency. That's nigh on impossible unless you've got a really, really good start like this one, where I've got 2 mountains. Even saying that, I would have to surround this campus with 4 districts in order to turn that into a +4. So it's really, really hard. I'd like to see more flexibility with district bonuses and how they play, and I really think like the Government Plaza style of doing that would be a really, really interesting way of doing it. As I say, you don't have to necessarily use the bonuses that I'm saying, but we've seen that interesting, campus districts are very fun. The Mayans, whatever you want to call them, Korea, even Australia, the Netherlands, Japan, all of these civs that have differences with how campuses are used. They can be really, really cool. I'd like to see that expanded across the game. Which brings me to my third point, which is specialists. Now, if you didn't know, any district you build that has a use, so like a campus for instance, every time I put a building in it, and I've got one building at the moment in my campus, which is the library, you can see if I go down here, it says library within the campus. Every time I do that, it has 1 citizen slot. The university has a citizen slot, the research lab has a citizen slot, so a fully improved campus has the option of having 3 specialists in. The problem is that specialists are a little bit naff. Now you can see I'm getting 20 science from a city at the moment. If I plonk a specialist in, I believe I get 2 science. Pingala is sort of improving that a little bit more. But that's it, just 2 science per turn from a citizen. Now that citizen could be working another improved tile. For instance, at the moment it's taking it off this 3 food tile, this pillaged cattle pasture over there. But that's all it does. 2 science. That's it. The other specialists are pretty much just as naff. Priests give you 2 faith, those are the ones on holy sites. Encampments and commanders give you 1 production and 2 gold. Captains and harbours, 1 food, 2 gold. Merchants give you +4 gold. That is actually fairly decent. Engineers give you +2 production, and artists give you +2 culture. However, there is one big difference between this and a lot of other Civ games, and that is that you do not get any more great people points than you would normally be doing. What I would like to see is specialists giving you a bigger bonus. That +2, for instance, could easily be turned into a +3. And if, for instance, that also gave you a bonus great person point, you could imagine the increased, well, just specialisms you could make in an empire. Like if I knew that I get 1 more scientist point by having a specialist, I might throw a specialist into that much earlier game than I would be looking to do already. Specialists are almost never used. They are almost never used unless you specifically have like science lock on your city and you've forgotten about it, or because the population of your city is so overbearingly huge there's nothing else that you can do. Say you've got your cities a bit squashed or your population's like 50. Civ 5 I thought did it really well. With the increased specialist abilities, you could get policies and civics, for instance, all these cards. Civ 5 you could get culture policies that would unlock better specialisms. You could go democracy, or what was it called, freedom or something. I can't remember which of the ideologies it was, but you could get bonuses to specialists. They could reduce unhappiness. You could get more great people points from them. I'd love to see something introduced into the game like that, which would actually help you to make specialists a little bit thing. If we go back to my point previously, perhaps you could even have extra buildings that you put in campuses, as instead of getting adjacency bonuses in your campus, for instance, it made specialists better. Imagine if I had to choose, for instance, between the +2 adjacency in this campus or a building that had another specialist slot, but all specialists did double the amount. That would suddenly be a really interesting choice. At the moment, specialists, I think, are just, it's like a wasted potential of a thing. It could be in the game and it could be adding much more, I feel. Point 4 is on district scaling, and specifically some of the problems Civ 6 has with the scaling of production on certain improvements. Now, you'll all be familiar with the idea that the later into the game you are, the more districts cost. It's one of the ways that Civ 6 has tried to balance the idea that at the beginning of the game you have very limited production, and at the end of the game, because you've got electricity and nuclear power and the ability to actually fuse stars in the palm of your hand, suddenly building a settler or a district or a builder or trader or whatever it might be is going to be a lot easier than, you know, it might be later in the game. And to stop you from spamming everything, it makes things harder and harder throughout the game. The way that districts work, for instance, are all locked in to the idea that the production cost for a district gets harder and more expansive the later into the game you get. I believe, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the specifics are a little bit beyond me, but I believe it's tied in with the amount of techs and civics you have, just like a lot of the other mechanics in the game are as well. I know, for instance, that pillaging, when you pillage a tile and it gives you an amount of gold or faith or culture or whatever it might be, that is linked into how many things that you have unlocked. The upside to the way this does it is that it encourages you to have more consolidated super cities rather than just endless city spamming. That's always one problem Civ has always had, the idea that making 50 terrible cities can sometimes be better than 7 or 8 amazingly powerful cities. The game wants to balance it so that the tall, aka having less but better cities, and wide, which is more cities but less sort of powerful or less populous, you could say. Those ideas, you know, each playstyle is equal and fair, and you can play the game in any way possible. So that's the idea behind it. The problem I have with district scaling is that it's tied to your general empire ability, how many civics, how many techs, how far through the game you are, which means that when you settle a new city later into the game, it's almost impossible to build districts. Already you can see that a district at the moment on turn 37 in an online speed game is costing me 65 production. That's well over double what it was at the beginning of the game. Now, in this city it's okay, it's already at population 2, I've got a couple of builders out that are improving tiles, I can generally whip out the production to do that. But say if I were to settle a new city, that would suddenly be a problem. Often you can, you know, get to turn 150 in the game and go, oh look, hang on, there I saw Yosemite somewhere. here, for instance. So I'm going to later in the game go and settle to, go and introduce myself to Yosemite, settle the city, and then, a district cost me 150 turns to do. And yes, other things scale to it as well. Chopping tiles, for instance, is another thing that scales to how far through the game you are. So yes, I could get a builder in that city and chop a forest and rush the district through that way. But the problem I have with district scaling is that it means that if you settle later into the game, or even if you sort of have weaker cities later into the game, building districts becomes almost impossible. Now, I don't mind the idea that the bigger a city becomes, the harder it is to produce a district in it, but what I would like to see, and perhaps this isn't a widely shared opinion, but certainly it's my opinion after playing this game for far too long, I would like to see district scaling linked not to your empire score, aka how far through the trees you are, but instead linked to the city. So for instance, if I settle a city, the first district I put in it is always really cheap. The second district costs more, then the third, then the fourth, then the fifth. Maybe that is an exponential curve, so the first one might cost me 30 production, then 65, then 125, then 185. However you might want to do it, there might be some sort of arithmetic or geometric sort of progression of some kind. Doesn't matter how you choose to do that, but I would like to see it linked more to the city. That would mean that you can settle later into the game and really explore all the points of the map. Because this is the thing, right? This is the thing. All of the world, generally as we know it, is populated. There are countries everywhere. The whole world is expanded. But how many games have you seen of Civ, especially on bigger maps? This is a Highlands map, for instance, where large chunks of the game, large chunks of the map, I should say, are just left unimproved, because there's no point settling later into the game, because even if I were to whip a settler out and go and settle Yosemite, there's no point. The city can't do anything for me. It's a little bugbear of mine. I'd like to see it so that maybe the first district or two is cheaper. There are other mechanics going on with campuses and other districts where, for instance, if you're building a district that you don't have very much of, I believe there's some mathematic formula that works out the average of districts, and if you've got half of that district or less, it takes some of the production cost off it in order for you to sort of, not polarize and specialize too much. There are other mechanics that I quite like, but as I say, late game, district building is an absolute chore outside of your closest 7 or 8 cities. I'd like to see that just changed a little bit. Point 5 is deity difficulty scaling, and this applies pretty much to any sort of level of difficulty, be it immortal, emperor, king. Deity is a good extreme example of it. Now, in every wish list to every Civ there's ever been, and I would say that actually a lot of games outside of Civ this also applies to as well, it is not necessarily an issue confined to Civ. AI is a problem. These games are incredibly complicated, and getting the AI to competently play the game is tricky. We all wish for better AI, that's fine, but we're talking more about the way the game tries to replace that. The way that deity difficulty works is effectively it makes the game cheat. It gives the computer yield bonuses, 3 troops, 3 techs, to basically boost it along. What it doesn't do is improve the AI in any way. So weirdly enough, the Prince AI and the Deity AI play in exactly the same way. The game just has one default mode. I think some of the easier difficulties, it doesn't do things like, declare war and, really abuse you in a particular way, but generally speaking, the game is pretty consistent on how it plays itself. The deity difficulty and the other difficulties are all based on improvements and bonuses the AI gets over you. The issue is that every deity game plays the same. The computer has a huge head start on you. It starts with extra warriors, extra settlers, extra builders, extra techs, and it accelerates away. It means that early game, unless you're playing on a lower difficulty, building wonders is nigh on impossible. Getting some of those early game writers, scientists is just jokingly difficult, because the computer will have 4 campuses set up by the time you've even unlocked writing. It also means that every single guide tells you basically to hold on until you get to the atomic era, the information era, because as soon as you unlock things like bombers, helicopters, drones, rocket artillery and nukes, you can claw your way back into the game at that point. You are cleverer than the computer, so when you start popping cities down with research labs, you can specialize your cities far more, and you can overtake. Every game plays out the same. If you haven't lost by turn 150 and you're still in the game, chances are you'll be able to claw your way back in. Conversely, if you're still surviving by turn 50, you've done pretty well. At the moment, I'm running this game just because I'm not really playing it. I'm playing it on difficulty 4, which is Prince. I've also got quite a bit of space, so I know that I'm not going to get a war card surge. Well, I also got Gilgabro, so I can just declare friends with him, but that was purely coincidental. But say I'd started next to a very angry Zulu, or even the Netherlands, or whoever it might be, all you know is that you'll be playing for 10 turns and suddenly 5 warriors will line up around you, all with their deity combat bonus, and then you'll die. I would love it if difficulty was implemented a little bit more creatively into the game. I'd love it if the bonuses slided so that they got better the later into the game you were, so that the computer felt a little bit more organic in how they played the game. I would remove some of the starting bonuses, and I would tie them more into the game age. So for instance, Deity produces 2-3 settlers for the computer. That's fine. What I would probably do is not give them a 3 settler at the beginning of the game, but I would give them 3 settlers as the game went through. So as, for instance, the game went from the ancient to classical era, then they get a 3 settler. Next era, give them a 3 settler. Next era, give them a 3 settler. All that sort of thing. I'd like to see it so that the science boost they got better the later into the game, maybe 15% every era, so that every time you went later through the game, the bonus got harder and harder and harder. It would feel like the computer couldn't rush you early game as hard. You would have a fairer start into the game, and it would also make the late game more challenging as they organically became stronger and stronger. You leave the AI to turtle, and by turn 200, well, they'll be making as many nukes as you. As I say, we can all wish for better AI, but I do think there's a sensible way of doing deity difficulty that is less on cheating bonuses and more organic things that get harder through the game. Conversely, point 6. Rubber band mechanics. Now, you've all played Mario Kart or other games. The idea behind rubber band mechanics is that the further behind you are, the more the game pulls you back. The idea is to not create a false narrative in terms of who's winning the game. If you're winning, great, that's brilliant. The game shouldn't take that victory away from you. You can always play as hard as you can, and you can win as capably as you can. The idea is that you can't fall that far behind. Now, there are 2 reasons I would argue that rubber banding should be brought into Civ a lot harder. First of all, it would encourage different playstyles. The joy of Civ, and what I think Civ was going for quite heavily when they designed Civ 6 over the other ones, is the idea that you can play any way you want. I think that the introduction of Eurekas and sort of all of these boosts in civics and techs and all these things, a lot of them being map dependent, like sailing being settled on the coast, building wonders, owning 3 archers, owning 3 musketmen. I love that. I think that was one of the biggest genius strokes that Sid Meier's team have come up with in a long time. I think it works spectacularly well. I do also think, and maybe some of the other veteran players would agree with me, is that there is a particular way to play the game really well. There are certain turns, you do certain things, there are certain styles to play certain games, and especially when you want to beat deity difficulty, you have to play the game in a certain way, effectively sort of to anti-cheese the game. I would love it if I could choose to really lean into the shipbuilding and only have coastal cities that did crazy things and have water tiles, or maybe I have an empire that just does insanely different things and I could still compete, and rubber banding would be the certain way that you could effectively implement that without breaking the game too much. There's also a specific sort of thing that I've seen before. Let's say I wasn't on 16 techs. Let's say I'd gone all the way through to tanks and I was on like 50-60 techs. And let's say Gilgabro over here had demolished Nubia, who later into the game I had a warrior over and I walked over and I liberated them. Hooray! Nubia comes back into the game. The problem is Nubia may only be on 10 techs whilst everybody else in the world is on 50-60. Now, that's fine, you may say, okay, they didn't research for text, but the problem is that's not how the world works. The classical era, or maybe even into the game later when you get to the atomic era, the world is highly teched. Yes, some countries have it better than others. We think about the real world, America, Europe, Australia, a lot of these colonized and more heavily infrastructured first world countries are much higher in tech, in wealth, in science. I get that, but equally if you go to any country in the world, you'll still see mobile phones, you'll still see branding, you'll still see airports. Even if a city or a nation didn't discover that tech for themselves, it still exists. Once the world age becomes, more and more progressed, ultimately you're gonna discover those things. What I would love to see is, say I was 20 techs behind and I was trading with a civ over here that was 20 techs ahead of me. Just like Russia and Petter's bonus gives trade routes extra science and extra culture for trading with someone ahead of them, I would like to see that sort of mechanic implemented into the game. I would also like to see, say we were all in the Renaissance era and you didn't have ancient or classical era techs, I'd like to see bonuses to old techs based on the fact that other people have researched them. Maybe you, for instance, could have a thing on top of Eureka's where, say, 30% of the tech cost divided by the number of players on the map. As soon as people start to research that tech, it becomes easier and easier to do it. I mean, if, 7 people have fighter jets, and you're the 8th researching it, it's going to be easier than trying to discover that tech the first time. What it would do is make that being the tech leader that little bit harder, but they're still playing the game normally because there's just no bonuses. But if you're behind, you would be able to pull yourself back into the game. It would kind of narrow the group up a little bit and make it so that people didn't fall too far behind. Now, I know this is a more controversial point of view. I think there's a lot to gain from rubber banding the game a little bit, and what I'm saying is I'm not saying we go for equality, like if Christine is on 16 techs, everybody should be 13 minimum. What I'm saying here is that, say the world was on, as I say, the modern era, you could get to the point where Renaissance era techs, which are too far, too behind, or 2 eras behind, these become much easier to research, because ultimately researching banking is much easier when some people have begun to unlock stock exchanges. Anyway, let me know what you think about that one. I appreciate that's a little bit of a case. I'm talking about taking the last maybe 50% of civs and pulling them back into the group, making the average kind of the same as the minimum. What I'm not talking about is penalising the people at the top. Point 7, improved governors. Again, governors being brought into the game I thought was a masterstroke, being able to add additional abilities onto cities, and then also having these abilities not replicable. Oh my goodness, you can't repeat them. I love this as an idea, I really do think they worked well. The problem I have is that some governors are better than others. Pingala, for instance, is used in pretty much every game, whereas Moksha, well, more specialised. What I would love to see is the introduction of governors that were more related to your civ abilities. Now, I think the Ottomans did this fantastically. If you remember, if you play as the Ottomans, the leader ability means that you have an 8th governor that appears with unique abilities, and those actually tie in nicely with the Ottoman playthrough. You can get extra damage to walls, more alliance points, all the kinds of things that work really well with the Ottoman style of play. I would love it if they expanded that into pretty much every civ. Now, that's a lot of work, I appreciate, but imagine this. Sweden do what they do really, really well. They have extra abilities to produce more tourism and culture by theming buildings. They have extra diplomatic favour, they get extra points, they get unique units. Imagine if Sweden had their own governor tree, where, for instance, when you looked at the promotions, it might be any themed building has a 25% bonus on top of the original bonus. Your unique units movements increased by 1 and they got 5 more combat strength. The extra +1 scientist point and engineer point went to +2. Imagine if you could just improve Sweden's natural abilities to make them even more Swedish than before. What it would mean is that you could use the default 7 governors that anybody can use, or you could move your governor. I'm not saying put more governor promotions in, this is the whole thing. You have less than before, the same as before, and you would use less on these 7, but the 8th, your civ, and maybe you can have one related to the civ and one related to the leader, in case you were playing someone like England or France or China that have multiple leader options. Just the idea that you could spend your governors to make your civilization bonuses even better. For me, I love that. I just think that would be really, really cool. It would take a lot of work, I appreciate that, but I really, really do think that's something that Civ 7 could expand on. Or hey, even if we got another piece of DLC, I could see that being a really cool introduction. Imagine, for instance, you're playing as England, and where it says you get an extra mines, or sort of mines on coal and iron give you more strategic resources. Maybe you can improve the resources, or give yourself more electricity, or build more boats, or whatever it might be. I just think there's some options there to make the game even more unique, so that every civ feels that little bit more unique than the others. Point 8. Steel walls and general adjacency / sieging of cities. Now this is a fantastic example because Nazca didn't look like this last turn. Let me just roll back a turn. Now let's say I wanted to go to war with Nazca. Hooray! Declare war on them. Their city will be tribute to the blood gods of Sweden. I declare war on them. My army begins to march over. I'm going to lead glorious sacred archer warfare upon them. And before you know it, bang, walls appear out of nowhere. Now how many times has that happened to you? Walls will just instantaneously appear mid-combat. It doesn't matter if that city's on half health, maybe even on a quarter health. It doesn't matter if it's sieged and every district around it is burning and the citizens are screaming out in pain. Bam! A wall can just appear from nowhere. And the problem is, even if you could argue, oh well, yes of course Ryan, walls have to appear as a building at some point, you build them and you build them, you build them, and you know, eventually it has to appear and the game loads them in. And let's just say, you know what, it's just an upgrade between wars to medieval wars, maybe even medieval to Renaissance wars, that's fine. But the problem is that it doesn't matter how damaged that particular wall is at the start of the game. Even if you went to steel, that 400 fortification strength walls will just gloriously appear from nowhere around a broken city. I would propose a few changes to walls. Firstly, I would like it if the fortification health organically grew as you built the wall. Say the walls had 10 turns of strength, perhaps the fortification, or 10 turns of building I should say, fortification strength could build linearly or exponentially or geometrically, or however you want to sort of say it, in some sort of progression as you built it. So the walls don't just appear from nowhere, you see them being built and they give you strength. I'd also like it that you can't build walls if the city's being attacked or is damaged. That to me makes sense. I know that you have to repair walls before you can upgrade them, but you can just build walls from scratch if there's no fortifications on the city and they can just appear. I'd love it if there was some sort of limitation to that. I would also like it if siege equipment didn't become entirely redundant at just random points. We all know how it goes, battering rams bypass ancient era walls, so as long as you go up to walls, bam, the walls will sort of take more damage. But as soon as those walls become medieval, suddenly battering rams don't do anything. It's really, really annoying. So okay, we say that's fine, let's just say now siege towers can deal with medieval walls. Well, sorry, now Renaissance walls pop along and suddenly siege towers don't do anything. It's a very abrupt change, and I know technologically there is a lot of sense to that, but I would love it if siege equipment had limited or maybe reduced effect when the walls became too powerful, rather than just cutting off entirely. Siege towers maybe could be improved, maybe be another upgrade to siege towers to actually help to attack Renaissance walls, because nothing defeats Renaissance walls apart from siege equipment. They're incredibly annoying. Steel walls can be almost entirely impossible to defeat, so I would love it if walls were changed just a little bit so that siege equipment didn't become totally obsolete instantaneously. I'd love it if they fell away gradually. Equally, I've always hated the idea of steel walls just appearing and suddenly every single one of your cities just discover impenetrable walls. Steel walls, I'd love it if they improved from Renaissance further. I'd love it if walls were perhaps easier to build, or limes as a policy card was something that you could do. But the way that steel walls just all pop up, I just find that really tricky. It's like suddenly, oh yes, my citizens can now defeat a roving tank that can't do any damage with a city. Like, I hate to face it to you, if London, even if it had steel walls, if London was sat there with no army in it and someone ran tanks into it, the tanks would win. I don't know, I'd like Civ 7 or whatever the next sort of DLC, I'd like them just to have another look at walls. I think there's more that could be done there. One thing I would like to just point out is I think these wonder screens were possibly the best thing that Civ 6 brought in. I love them, I approve of them massively, it was awesome. Point 9. Religions and Pantheons. Now we've all been there, you're very, very excited to found your religion until you realise that somebody else has grabbed Feed the World. Well, yeah, that's fine, maybe you're after work ethic, whatever it may be. Also, the thing about the game is that there are multiple religions that just can't be picked. You get loads and loads of options on the screen, but the map limits you to a certain amount. Now I'm playing on a dual map right now, so 2 religions is absolutely fine. We don't need to worry about that too much, but let's say we were playing on a huge map, well, it doesn't matter if there are 12 players, there are only 7 religions available. Because of the way that religious choices are just totally limited, even if I, for instance, pick Buddhism, well, there's only so many choices, and as you get religions, those choices become less and less. The idea being that the faster you get the religion, the more choices you've got, and it has an emphasis to getting that religion as quick as possible. Pantheons are the same. You're not going to get your free settler if someone grabbed it 5 turns before. Make sure that everyone plays a little bit differently. The problem is that not all choices are equal. Some are much better than others. Work ethic and feed the world are leagues better than divine inspiration and warrior monks, generally speaking. Equally, some choices just work really well for certain civs, like for instance the Kemans really love feed the world or work ethic, but if you don't get them, then you're just going to get into trouble. What I would like to see is a couple of changes to religions and pantheons. Firstly, just like pantheons, everybody can get a religion. Everybody gets one, and it's much easier to get a religion. I would also like it that anybody can take any belief, even if that belief has already been taken by somebody else. The reasoning for that is such: every religion in the world is not entirely separate. As we go through human history, you may notice that a lot of religions, especially in neighbouring countries or even in the same countries, share a huge amount of tenets and beliefs with other religions. It's just the case that sometimes there is a lot of similarity. What I instead would like to see is not an option where if something's been picked, another civ cannot pick that exact same thing. I would either like to see a situation where, for instance, if you picked Feed the World, then you get a bonus to Feed the World for picking it first, and then everybody else that picks Feed the World after that point gets a slightly reduced ability. So for instance, the first person that picked it got +4 food and +3 housing, and everybody else got the 3-2. Or maybe the first person got 3-2 and everybody else got 2-1, for instance. Something like that. That would encourage people getting religions early, but it wouldn't screw everybody over that really needed that benefit. The other option would be having some sort of order where the faster you get your religion, the more beliefs you get at the beginning of the game. So say everybody gets the same choices, but because Eastern Orthodoxy was picked up before my religion, maybe they unlock 1 or 2 of the locked tenets first. So the first prophet has 2 spare ones, the second and third prophets have 1 extra one, and then everybody else just starts with the base 2 abilities. So an emphasis to get a better or a more complete religion faster into the game, but not screwing people over for not getting one quickly. The fact is, some people just get quicker religions. Russia, for instance, will get a religion before you no matter what you do. Religion is often overlooked as an idea in the game because people don't particularly like religious victories, but it's often seen as, well, unless you beeline religions, your religion can't really add anything unless you get a very particular set of beliefs and that stack up with your play. I'd love it if religions were more open and flexible. You could choose whatever you wanted at any stage of the game, but there's just more open. I want people to be able to play the game no matter how they want, so encouraging there to be benefits to picking up an early great profit, but not screwing everybody else over. Again, I'd be interested to know your thoughts on this one, because I realise that's a different style of thought to how the game has been set up. Point number 10. Bridges. Now, bridge districts should be a thing. I know that bridges exist to an extent where if I built a road over this river, then a bridge would appear and suddenly people can travel over it. I get that. But bridge districts, they should be a thing. They really should be a thing. Just being able to expand travel over small things of water. Now, I know bridge districts exist as modded things, but it's something I would love to see in the base game. I know that the AI or the implementation of them is quite tricky, and that's often why people say that they're not in the game already. But come on, Civ, bridges would be a really cool thing to add. So there you are, 10 things I would like to see brought into Civ 6 and Civ 7. Let me know what things you would like to see. I'm talking sweeping large changes that would be needed as large DLC packs. I'm not talking about the little things. I'm going to add another video soon talking about the little things I'd like to improve with Civ generally. We're talking about the greater, more sweeping things here that just I could see being really beneficial. Leave me a comment. I want to hear about what your ideas are. Let me know which one of my 10 ideas you think is really good and which ones are really bad. And just remember, everyone's opinion on this matter is totally different. You're not going to agree with everything I say. That's totally fine. Make sure your comments are nice and constructive, eh? Hope you enjoyed a slightly different video. I need to go and think about what 2000 hours in Civ actually means for my life and expectations with it. As I have that deep moral crisis, I'll see you next time. Goodbye! And finally, a very special shout out goes to Scott Stratton, Major King Kong, Matthew Wilkinson, Salty Tech, The Broccoli, Midnight Oil and Truffadaskby for all of your support on Patreon. Thank you everybody for all of your support generally. It is brilliant. See you on my next video.